Let's jump right into this explainer, shall we? If you've been keeping an eye on international trade lately, you already know the landscape is shifting under our feet. Today, we're not just painting with broad strokes. We're digging into the actual grounded data to unpack the mechanics of the newly proposed U.S. reciprocal tariffs. Specifically, we're going to look at how these policies are sending ripple effects across the global economy, with a really sharp focus on Southeast Asia.
So would reciprocal tariffs actually eliminate trade deficits? Well, this is the million-dollar question that academics, policymakers, and global markets are all frantically trying to figure out right now. The stated goal here is literally just to balance the books. But, the economic machinery of global trade almost never operates in a straight line. The ripple effects go way beyond simple math.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll define what reciprocal tariffs actually are. Second, we'll look at the hit to global trade. Third, we'll dive into ASEAN's diplomatic strategy. And finally, we'll check out some specific country responses.
All right, part one. What exactly are reciprocal tariffs, and what are the mechanics behind this policy?
Essentially, a reciprocal tariff in this context is an extra import duty slapped onto goods from a specific country. The U.S.'s stated rationale here is that these tariffs are absolutely necessary to counter practices that cause trade imbalances, things like regulatory barriers, differences in consumption tax rates, or even currency manipulation. The big idea is that if a country runs a massive trade surplus with the U.S., these hyper-targeted tariffs are designed to drive that specific bilateral deficit straight down to zero.
Now, check this out. It's fascinating to see how these proposed tariff rates directly scale with the size of a country's trade surplus with the U.S. Based on 2024 data, Vietnam is running a massive $123.5 billion surplus, and they're facing a really steep 46% proposed tariff. But then compare that to Singapore. Their surplus is a much smaller $2.8 billion, so they're looking at a baseline 10% tariff. It's a highly mathematical approach, specifically targeting that deficit divided by U.S. imports.
Moving on to part two, the hit to global trade and the shockwaves this sends through the entire multilateral system. To really grasp the disruption we're talking about, you have to understand the golden rule of the World Trade Organization, the Most Favored Nation Principle, or MFN. Basically, MFN says you have to trade without discrimination. If a country lowers a trade barrier, it has to do so equally for all its trading partners. So applying totally different tariff rates to different countries, like we literally just saw on that table, directly challenges this core pillar. It's a massive shift from a multilateral, rules-based system to a very bilateral, transactional one.
And here are those broader shockwaves. When you bypass the WTO framework, global trade tensions are absolutely going to increase. Supply chains, which, let's face it, are incredibly complex and tangled up, face massive disruptions as companies scramble to dodge new costs. And ultimately, this raises a very real concern for everyday people: higher costs at the checkout counter and the heavy pressure of inflation. It really makes us ask, does anyone actually get a lower tariff benefit out of this, or does everyone just end up footing a bigger bill?
Okay, part three. Let's zoom in on ASEAN's diplomatic strategy and their regional response.
They actually saw this coming. Back on April 10th, ASEAN economic ministers huddled up for a special meeting specifically to address this changing landscape. Rather than panicking, they formed a task force to monitor the situation and coordinate a unified response. They know that a single member state might not have a ton of leverage on its own, but together, collectively, they represent an absolutely vital hub for global trade.
This brilliantly illustrates the contrast in strategies. You have the bilateral, tariff-driven U.S. approach on one side versus ASEAN's commitment to multilateral agreements on the other. ASEAN ministers have explicitly stated they are not going to retaliate against the U.S. Instead, their playbook is to uphold the WTO, work with willing partners, and really double down on strengthening their own intra-ASEAN market. It's all about deep resilience and finding strength in regional unity, rather than getting sucked into a tit-for-tat tariff war.
Finally, part four, specific country responses. Let's look at the different economic levers these nations are actually pulling.
First up is Singapore. Now, earlier we noted they only face a 10% tariff, but Singapore is a hyper-connected, incredibly trade-dependent nation. So even with a lower direct tariff, they're still anticipating a lower GDP growth forecast for 2025, strictly because of the broader fragmentation of global trade. They feel those secondary shockwaves intensely.
Rather than lashing out, Singapore's response is highly defensive. They're focusing inward on fiscal interventions and protecting their workforce to stabilize the domestic economy. They spun up a national task force to help businesses navigate the chaos.
They're pumping in financial support through grants and loans and putting a massive emphasis on job reskilling and digital transformation.
Next, we have Vietnam, which is one of the world's most export-reliant economies, and they are staring down the barrel of a proposed 46% tariff. Unlike Singapore, Vietnam is deeply directly exposed to the U.S. market, and quite frankly, analysts point out they have very little leverage in a direct confrontation.
To put that vulnerability into perspective, just consider this jarring metric: 30%. The U.S. is Vietnam's biggest export market, making up a staggering 30% of its entire GDP in 2024. Just let that sink in for a second. Nearly a third of their entire economy relies on exporting to the very country proposing a 46% tariff on their goods.
Because of that immense exposure, Vietnam went straight into hyper-diplomacy mode. Communist Party chief To Lam even contacted President Trump directly in early April to negotiate the trade imbalance. Their strategy is incredibly proactive. They're proposing a reciprocal trade agreement, trying to knock down non-tariff barriers, improving their environment for foreign direct investment, and urgently scrambling to find new export markets. Basically, they're trying to negotiate their way into a lower tariff bracket.
Our last case study is Indonesia, facing a 32% tariff rate. Now, their exports to the U.S. only make up about 2 to 3% of their GDP, so overall, they're much less integrated into the U.S. economy than Vietnam. But for specific sectors, think textiles, footwear, industrial machinery, the exposure is still absolutely critical.
Indonesia is getting creative. They're pulling some completely unique levers, like explicitly increasing their own U.S. imports and relaxing local tech rules just to directly chip away at that bilateral trade deficit. They even signed a non-disclosure agreement on bilateral economic security. They're pushing domestic deregulation to make business cheaper, easing up local content rules for the tech sector, and, most directly, buying more U.S. crude oil and agricultural goods to balance the scales. It's a highly pragmatic, multi-pronged approach.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really powerful sentiment from Singapore's Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong. When talking about the strain these tariffs put on the global system, he bluntly stated that these are not actions one does to a friend. It's a stark reminder, right? Behind all the spreadsheets, the task forces, and the aggregate numbers, there are real human diplomatic relationships on the line. It leaves us with one big question. How will these massive economic maneuvers ultimately reshape the future of global friendships, alliances, and the very foundation of international trade? Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning the data.